Hello, everybody. Welcome to our final wrap-up session of the Israel Dialogues. I'm Rabbi Goodman. It's good to be with you all. And I'll say not a bittersweet moment, but it's been so lovely having this regular dialogue with you on Friday afternoons. And so I'm incredibly grateful to this panel for adding one more session. Just to wrap up all that we've heard and to look at some of the topics of the day. I don't want to take up any time because there's so much to cover. And so I'll just say my thanks to the panelists, to David, to Mark, John, Dylan, Derek, Howard. Thank you all for your time and for your expertise for the last few weeks. I'll also send a special thanks to Helena and David Fine for their gift of sponsorship, making this series possible, as well as all of our co-presenting partners for this series. We really are appreciative and could not have done it without you. So thank you all. I'm going to invite David to join me on screen here. We'll, as always, David kind of set the framework for conversation. And then I will stop speaking so we can let the experts the floor. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity for all of us on the organizing panel to come back together and have a conversation. We've had the privilege of having some wonderful guests with us who have helped us become better informed on a range of issues that affect Israel. And while we obviously don't have the time to reflect on everything, between the comments and questions that you, the viewers, sent into us and our own conversation, we developed a brief agenda where we would hit on a number of issues that we thought were most important. And we anticipate that not only will we cover these, but they are likely to spin off into other areas. We've tried to take into account the questions and comments that many of you submitted, and hopefully we'll be able to cover, if not all of them, at least some of them in the way we've structured the discussion this afternoon. So it really will be a conversation. We continue to welcome your questions or your comments. Please send them into the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom, and we'll try and track those. And for now then, I think that's the only thing that we really have to note, that it's a chance to reflect on what has occurred over the last months, and also we are cognizant of the importance of integrating our thoughts with what is happening now. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, the dramatic increase in violence within Israel, and the pressures and perhaps opportunities that these events afford us. So with that, let me first turn to John Allen, who's going to begin a conversation around the domestic situation within Israel. John.
Thank you, David. Thanks, Rabbi. We couldn't begin a conversation about what's happening in Israel with talking about the recent violence that we have all witnessed. We send our condolences and sympathies to those who have suffered, friends and family, and we know the fear that Israelis must be experiencing. I'll just briefly talk about that violence, and then I'll move on to the political situation. There have, as most of you know, been 4 attacks. 2 of them came out of Jenin, which is in the West Bank. the Bnei Brak attack and the Tel Aviv attack, which occurred yesterday, where 2 people were killed and at least 10 injured. 2 others, the Beersheba and the Hadera attacks, came from within Israel, Palestinian Israelis, and those were characterized by the media and by the security forces as having a connection to ISIS. I think the Jenin attacks are more traditional, and the Israeli security services have more intelligence about those. We've heard recently that the 2 attacks that came from within Israel were a surprise, and these are not normally things that that the security services are paying as close attention to. Jenin, of course, is a hotbed of sort of radicalism in the West Bank. After the attacks, Israeli forces have gone into Jenin, and they have neutralized some alleged other violence, and the Israeli forces are reporting that they have stopped 13 other possible attacks. These were not initially connected to Ramadan, which began last week. You'll recall from last year when violence erupted around Damascus Gate at the time of Ramadan, which then unfortunately led both to the conflict in Gaza and to intercommunal violence in Israel. Those were directly related to activities in and around the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa, and the Damascus Gate. So far, these have been separate, but I think there are real concerns that today and potentially next Friday, there could be other violence. We all hope that there won't be. Just looking to the future, there is a conversation going on about whether they are going to place restrictions on Palestinians. They had made a real effort to keep the employment passes that were permitting Palestinians to work in Israel open. There was an effort to try and allow as many Palestinians that wanted to visit Al-Aqsa to do so. And now there's a debate about whether they're going to have to restrict. Benny Gantz has been taking a tough line, and Bibi Netanyahu, who spoke at a rally 2 days ago, said, of course, that he is the only person that can keep Israel safe. Let me now turn, if I could, just briefly to the political situation. As most of you again know, one member of Naftali Bennett's Yamina party, Idit Silman, left the coalition, which reduced the coalition from having a 1-seat majority to having 60 seats, the same as the opposition. Up until now, the government has done a particularly good job, and to some a surprising job, of maintaining unity, passing its budget, passing other significant policies in the areas of health and education. And people were, I think, obviously the supporters of the coalition were pleasantly surprised that it continued to exist. So what are the ramifications of what's just happened? Well, first of all, the government won't easily be able to pass legislation. They will need one vote from the opposition, at least one, in order to pass legislation without some support. Secondly, there's more pressure on the Bennett government, on Bennett in particular, from his existing coalition members. They are looking for either money for their causes, they're looking for policy changes, and we've already seen that they're putting pressure on him and threatening to withdraw from the coalition, and he's had in a couple of cases to cave and provide Benny Gantz for pensions, increased budget for the pensions of the military, another pressure point from one of his own members. What it does not mean is that the government is going to fall tomorrow. Now, why is that? Because of those 60 seats in the opposition, 6 of them are held by the Joint Arab List. So Likud and its traditional partners, the Orthodox, both Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, and another party do not in themselves have enough votes to topple the government. So the government can continue on as long as it can survive and it maintains its 60 seats, and it can try and pass some legislation if they can get somebody, 1, 2 more members of the Joint Arab List to join them. That won't necessarily be easy. As you know, there's one party in the coalition that is Arab already, and they will not want to see necessarily benefits going to the other parties, but it's complicated. We'll see what happens. However, if the opposition can muster enough votes to topple the government, then we're into 2 scenarios. One is another election. Now, most of the current coalition don't want another election because most of them see that they will probably do worse if that happened. Likud, of course, wants another election, and some of his supporters in other parties as well. The other option is a new government. So you don't have to necessarily go to a new election. It's like the Canadian Parliament. If one party happens to, is able to put together a coalition, then a coalition of Likud, with or without Bibi Netanyahu, could form another government. Just to say one other thing, one second last thing, if they do go to an election, then Yair Lapid becomes the prime minister at that time, and he will remain prime minister until that election occurs, which often in Israel can take 6 months between the determination of it, the campaign, etc. I'm sure Yair Lapid would love that to happen, because whether or not he's a caretaker prime minister, being prime minister is a much better place to run a campaign than not being so. Finally, I will just mention that the trial of Bibi Netanyahu continues. It's not been going particularly well for him. One of his closest aides and basically testified a couple of weeks ago and ended up providing pretty damning testimony against him. There is no talk at the moment of an impunity deal that may come. Finally, Iran never is removed from the news cycle in Israel. There's always much talk. Of course, there is no deal yet in between the P5+1 and Iran, so we'll wait to see what happens. And I will turn it over to the rest of my colleagues for their comments.
I'm happy to jump in, John. I guess something I don't know that I really have an answer to it, but what this does to Israel's diplomatic interests in the short term in the region and its relationship with the Biden administration, I mean, what it's trying to do vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine piece, just the instability in the government and the idea that Netanyahu could be back is quite interesting. And then the other question I have, and I actually don't know the answer to this, is, is there any arrangement, or do people see arrangements under which somebody else could become the prime minister that, in a right-wing coalition that's not Netanyahu? Because there was an a lot of this was about getting Netanyahu out. So that's something that popped into my own mind. Again, I don't know that I really have an answer to it.
I guess I would just say there's been a lot of speculation about Benny Gantz, who got screwed by Bibi before, who doesn't particularly like either Lapid. They were in a coalition and then split, and he doesn't like Bennett particularly, and he would love to be prime minister, something he didn't quite get when he was supposed to. And whether or not the various anti-Bibi forces can come together under somebody like him or somebody in Likud now. It's really hard, as you say, hard to know.
I just also observe the if you look at the history of Netanyahu, the idea that he'll do and say anything to put something together in the short term, but that he'll also double cross anybody and sort of whether he's able to maneuver people into believing him again will be fascinating. And I mean, you know, the Benny Gantz deal is a good example along those lines. And the fact that the woman from whose name is escaping me from the Yamina party that reportedly was offered a deal to defect to Likud, though she says she wasn't, as far as I can tell in the media today. But what would have been promised, and I guess to me, I mean, why anybody would believe what Netanyahu has to say will be fascinating to watch.
She, of course, denies, as you said, that she was offered any deal. She denies that it had anything to do with Hametz, the legislation and the Supreme Court decision. But it sounds a little bit like she's trying to clean up her act on her way to some other party, because it didn't look good to break up a government because of minor things. I see David first and then Derek have their hands up.
Mine is less a question than it is a comment. Isn't this a transient problem which once again simply shows the inherent instability of trying to form a multi-coalition government where the largest party of that coalition is actually not leading? I mean, you mentioned Gantz, you mentioned Bennett, both of them are not the strongest, do not represent the largest groups within that coalition. So we're looking at a structural problem that it seems to me Israel can't afford to allow to drift. And I know there have been for decades discussions about electoral reform, and they don't go very far. There have been lots of studies, but it just seems to me so problematic to try and have a coalition that is formed around being anti-Bibi. As much as I am anti-Bibi, I don't see this sufficient of establishing a stable government.
Derek.
Whoops. Yeah. So I get a couple of questions. One is about spin. I mean, does anybody in Israel take seriously Idit Silman, the claim that she made that this had to do with the, you know, the fact that you could not require a guard to look in the bags of people coming into hospitals during Passover to see if they had a sandwich, you know, tucked away in their purses, which a regulation that evidently was in place a year ago, last Passover, and nobody said boo. So, I mean, do people in Israel really believe this? And the second is, I'm wondering about how quickly this is spiraling, because isn't there another Yamina MK now who's made much more concrete demands near Orbach? I mean, he's demanding that illegal outposts be hooked up to the electrical grid, and he's demanding, you know, commitment to thousands of new settlement units of construction of new units in the West Bank, and subsidies for yeshivas. I mean, it just seems like this is very quickly spiraling. And I agree with you that it's hard to think of a replacement government at this time, but it seems like there is some kind of revolt going on within Yamina that that makes things much more unstable.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I would just say in response to David's comment, the amazing thing about Israel, of course, is its economy has never been stronger. The shekel is strong. Tel Aviv is now the most expensive city in the world. So, you know, despite this instability, which is constant, this ridiculous coalition governments and everything else that seems to be going on that we pay attention to, the country moves, at least at some levels it moves. So it's the resilience is pretty amazing.
Still on the domestic, what about the impact of the violence that we've seen from both those in territories, but those who are Israeli Arabs? How serious is that? It's obviously very serious in terms of both personal and community safety and security, but how serious is it in terms of its political implications? Does it play out in politically in the electoral process, in organizing parties or pushing the government to be more vulnerable?
I mean, I imagine that it makes the government a bit more vulnerable because I think Netanyahu's line to the people has always been, I'm the only one that's going to be able to keep you safe.
Right.
And I also think it's causing a bit of a rally around the flag effect for the right wing, sort of saying, what are you doing over here, for those of them that are sitting in the coalition? But I think the other complicating factor on the domestic political piece is, we think about a majority in terms of there being like a slight shift, and then there would be a majority that would be able to vote against. But in this case, there's the joint list sitting there that doesn't necessarily have an imperative to do what either side, wants it to do. So, I don't know what it would do to the actual internal operating dynamic of the coalition in terms of, the relationships between the Arabist Party and Yamina and so on. But I think it just puts pressure in right-wing circles on those Yamina MKs, and you can see it. I mean, you can see and Netanyahu is playing his cards intelligently on it.
Mark?
Yeah, I was going to just chime in and say that in answer to David's question, the impact on the electoral, the voters of Israel, I don't think it would. The violence will have much impact. I don't think there would be people from the left center shifting to the right because of this, and certainly people from the right are not going to move their allegiance to the center or left. So I don't think that this happens. This has happened before, and it hasn't really, in terms of polling and so on, shifted the opinions of Israelis one way or the other on this particular issue in terms of how they would vote in an upcoming election.
Yeah, and this government hasn't been particularly pro-Palestinian, weak, two-state solution. This has been a government that has wanted to shrink the conflict, to increase the economic benefits to Palestinians, but they have moved ahead on some settlements and some evictions. So I mean, they're not sort of pro-left progressive in that sense. The one area where they've moved is on the religious issues, and but that's kind of unrelated to the violence. So I would agree with Mark that I'm not sure that this will have an impact unless it's the beginning of a terrible trend in which any government will suffer if they can't deal with violence that increases significantly. And I think we really do have to worry about what might or might not happen around Ramadan, Pesach, Easter, etc.
Any other significant issues that we want to raise right now on the current domestic political scene? No? So recently there was what some have argued a significant summit among those who have emerged as partners in the Abraham Accords that took place in Sde Boker. And it initially looked like it was going to get a great deal of attention, and that seemed to slide off the front pages and even inside pages because other things perceived greater consequence captured news. But this is an issue of concern, and we'd like to, I think, spend some time looking at both the summit and the larger context of the Abraham Accords. Mark, you're going to make some comments on that?
Right. So this was a very, I think, interesting development under the umbrella of the Abraham Accords. Took place March 27, 28, just last week in Sde Boker, which in and of itself was an interesting locale for Israel to host this meeting of the foreign ministers. As many of you know, and I'm sure many of you have actually been to Sde Boker. It was the southern home of David Ben-Gurion and his wife Paula, and they spent all of their time there when he retired from political life. Lived on the kibbutz at Sde Boker, and they're both buried in a beautiful site overlooking the desert. And so for them to have this meeting of the foreign ministers there, I think also was very symbolic on the part of the Israelis to do it, and for the foreign ministers of these Arab countries to come and be there. And actually, there was, if time had permitted, there was actually talk that they were going to together collectively make a visit to the graves of David Ben-Gurion and his wife Paula. The meeting took place among some of the members of the Abraham Accords, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Morocco, together with Egypt, Israel, and the United States. Secretary of State Blinken was there as well in attendance. Sudan, which is the other country that joined in on the Abraham Accords last year, over a year ago, did not participate. And the other interesting country that did not participate was Jordan, the other country that has diplomatic relations with Israel. There was some talk about some ongoing disputes between Israel and Jordan regarding administration of the Temple Mount and some other issues. So for that reason, it seemed that the foreign minister of Jordan did not attend. But at the time that the meeting was taking place, it's interesting that King Abdullah of Jordan was actually visiting Palestinian leadership in Ramallah. The meeting really, from the press reports, and as David indicated, the press reports were very limited, indicated that there were two significant agenda items, one being the security, this regional security that they all wanted to come together and talk about in joining their efforts together, and the second one being Iran, because that's of concern to all of those countries. There hasn't been a lot said publicly yet about what really resulted in their deliberations. We might hear more about that in the coming weeks. One of the interesting things also from my perspective is that they agreed at the end of their session that this would become an annual gathering of the foreign ministers, and that they would rotate the location of these meetings, much like the Group of Seven, the G7, meets every year and meets in a different country hosts that meeting. So we can see this becoming an ongoing event. And it's, again, an offshoot, and a significant offshoot, I think, of the Abraham Accords. And as other Arab countries may join in under the rubric of the Abraham Accords and enter into diplomatic and peaceful relations with Israel, they too will become part of this group. Again, not a lot of publicity. I was in Israel last week when meeting was taking place in Sde Boker. There was Israeli press on it, to be sure, but not a lot of op-eds, not a lot of commentary by the significant op-ed writers about the significance or lack of this event. So maybe we'll hear more of it as some of these other events that John talked about within Israel hopefully subside, and maybe as hopefully the situation in Ukraine subsides, because those two particular news items are really dominating the news, not only here in North America, but also in Israel as well. So I think there's something to really watch here in terms of ongoing discussions, dialogue, and relationships between Israel and these countries under the Abraham Accords. There's a lot been happening. There are daily flights now between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and a lot of commercial activity occurring. The Israelis, and I'll just end it on this, in terms of their travels on a daily basis, more Israelis are going to the United Arab Emirates every day to visit and spend time on the beaches in the United Arab Emirates and go shopping there. It's a great place to go shopping. Than traveling anywhere else. The planes are packed, and it's indicated by the high airfares that one now has to pay to travel between Israel and that country. So things are shifting and moving, and it'll be interesting to see how things develop going forward. With that, I'll end. I'm sure if anyone has any comments or questions, or we can move on to
John has his hand up.
Oh,
Just a couple of comments. Thanks, Mark. I understood that part of the reason they did it in Sde Boker was because they wanted to avoid Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and the controversies over that. So it was an apt place to do it, and also a nice tribute, of course, to Ben Gurion, etc. And I think Jordan claimed that they weren't coming because the Palestinians weren't invited, and maybe the fact that the king was demonstrating his disfavor with that by actually visiting the Palestinians. The other thing just to mention is that my understanding is Morocco, the US, and Bahrain all did mention the Palestinian issue. So there was maybe a hope, or that they wouldn't get into this stuff, but for them anyways, the Palestinian issue was still on the table. The UAE didn't raise it at all. And I think both Egypt and Morocco raised Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine. So there were on the margins of this get together and a love in a couple of issues that are still on the table. So we'll see what happens going forward. I think there was even some talk of the Turks coming at one point, but they, for some reason they didn't come. But eventually it may grow into something even bigger, especially if you get Saudi Arabia on board.
right. Let me just respond. I think it would be understandable and actually somewhat unusual if some of those countries didn't mention these other ongoing issues, Jerusalem and the Palestinian issue. So, but I don't think they were from the reports I read, I don't think they were the main part of the discussions. I would also mention that the foreign minister of Bahrain and the foreign minister of Morocco both mentioned in their opening remarks the terrorist incident that occurred in Beersheba the day that the meetings opened, and expressed condolences for the loss of life and condemning these terrorist attacks. And that, I think, was also a significant statements on the part of both those foreign ministers.
I'd just like to add a comment that I think one of the things that we should track emerging from this is the range of, if you want to call them working groups or areas of interest that enhance opportunities for cooperation or collaboration, developing policies. I think that the history of building regional cooperation, if you look at Southeast Asia, for example, or the northern part of Latin America, the history suggests that areas of functional opportunity where everyone benefits. So whether it's water or it's regulatory regimes or the movement back and forth of students and academics, shared research projects, things that are relatively low level on the scale of high politics, but create functional cooperation. So while I know that others have written about the hope for regional security cooperation that could emerge from the Abraham Accords, I think the areas to really watch that perhaps will spin off from these annual meetings are the creation of working groups on specific topics that these countries can get together and share expertise, benefits, joint investments, and build up a degree of trust and confidence. So I think it was an important meeting and something that hopefully will really grow from strength to strength.
I think Howard had his hand up. Howard?
Yeah, Mark, I have a question. I read an op-ed, a Palestinian op-ed, that said that Jordan didn't participate because it was at Stayboker, and that because Ben-Gurion is seen to be so much responsible for the Nakba. Have you heard anything about that at all?
No, I haven't.
Anybody?
You know, I didn't hear anything about it. And if that was a report, I didn't read about it, but there's always a lot to read every day about Israel.
Yeah.
So one can't read everything, but I didn't see that.
I'll jump in, Mark. I just assume, and I think I said this before in a session, I mean, when you look at the Jordanians, I think their internal politics are probably pretty difficult on this, because I think in the Arab world broadly, the Arab street probably looks at this and says, well, this was a deal done with Donald Trump, and, you know, shame on these guys because they did something that a lot of people believe is an injustice. But I still think it's very important in terms of just starting to normalize Israel in the region. And I think the peace with Jordan isn't particularly warm, but it's peace. And even with the Egyptians, it's the same thing. And as you keep knocking countries off of that, or, you know, adding countries onto that list, especially if they were able to get Saudi Arabia, I think you take away the Arab world rejects Israel and wants to throw it into the sea dynamic of the conflict. And in some ways, I wonder, and I guess maybe this is rose-colored glasses for the whole thing, but I wonder whether that actually may put some pressure on Israel to settle some of their relations with the Palestinians. I think often it's put forward, well, you know, you're taking a bargaining chip in terms of recognition off the table vis-a-vis Israel. And if you do that, you know, the Israelis are never going to go forward and make peace with the Palestinians. But I think that's misunderstanding a little bit the natural place that the center of public opinion is in Israel, which is, you know, we want our country to exist and we want to be left alone. And I don't think most Israelis are that ideologically attached to the settlements. I think that they believe that the Arab world as a whole has rejected them, that the Palestinians aren't partners for peace, et cetera, and that gives an advantage to those who are ideologically driven, so that the others sort of say, well, you know, we're not going to worry that much about them because they're not the real problem. The real problem is Palestinian rejectionism. So, I mean, the whole thing makes me pretty hopeful, but, and I don't know, I mean, if that particular set of meetings was so consequential, but I think that, you know, more consequential to me is the warmth of the peace, specifically with the UAE, and the fact that all sorts of Israelis that I know, I see pictures of them on Facebook, you know, in Dubai, and it's bizarre. So that's pretty encouraging. But that's my question is, you know, if this may actually change some of the underlying fundamentals of the conflict.
That's good points, really good points.
It would be great if it did. You know, you change the mindset in Israel that they're not out to all throw us into the sea, and therefore Israelis can be more relaxed about Although, you know, lots of people say the Palestinians are out to throw them into the sea, not just the others. So they're going to have to get more relaxed about Palestinians, and the recent violence isn't going to help that in the short term.
Well, it's hard to imagine that certain countries now, like Bahrain and United Arab Emirates and Morocco, that now have diplomatic relations, exchanged ambassadors, set up embassies, are still wanting to throw Israel into the sea. That wouldn't make any sense, right? So things are moving, I think, in the right direction.
It's the Middle East. I think we have to remember that there were a lot of Israelis that used to go to Turkey and the islands, and then there was a period when they stopped, and then they started again. So let's hope that the UAE knows how to manage its relations better than Erdogan does with Israel.
There is I have a colleague who retired from the University of Washington, a Middle East historian / political scientist, who compared Israel's attitude towards the Arab world to Ernie and Bert from Sesame Street, where there's evidently a Sesame Street scene where there's a broken window and it's raining and the rain is coming into their home. And Bert says to Ernie, go outside and fix the window. And Ernie says, well, why should I do that? It's raining. If I go outside, I'll get wet. I'll wait till it's dry. And then the sun is out the next day. And Bert says to Ernie, okay, the sun is shining. So now you can go and fix the window. He says, why should I fix it? It's not raining. So he used that to describe Israel's position, that when they feel threatened, it's like, well, why should we make compromises? They want to destroy us. But then when Israel gets recognized in some way, why should we make compromises? Time is on our side. All we have to do is hold firm and do nothing. So I hope you're right that the normalization with parts of the Middle East and North Africa can lead to the other. I'm not entirely sure.
We'll see.
And what about the Palestinians in this? I mean, their views and the extent to which the Abraham Accords and however it gets embedded and spreads is going to constrain, or does it increase opportunity?
I think part of the answer will be how the Palestinian leadership responds to it. And right now, they haven't necessarily been responding in a way which one could describe as a positive response. But if they were to have maybe a bit more visionary about what the opportunities are for them under this scenario, taking into account how maybe these Arab countries could, in quotations, put some diplomatic and political pressure on Israel to move the needle, then if they see that as an opportunity, then things could even change more. But right now, under the current Palestinian leadership, it's hard to envision significant change in terms of their perspective, at least from what I've seen.
I think that one of the fundamental challenges there on the Palestinian side is, that the crux of the conflict is about, for the Palestinians, this is about what they view as a fundamental injustice. I mean, we remember Professor Khalidi's session. And for Israelis, this is about security and recognition and saying, like, we're here and we're not going away. And both view, things still through that lens of 1948. And I think that they're pretty absolutist positions, although, again, for Israel, the reason I think often on the pro-Israel side, it's said, well, Israel made all the compromises, that it was able to make back in the early 2000s and in the 90s, and the answer was terrorism. But I don't think Zionism ever staked a claim saying to be successful, they needed all of the land between the river and the sea. And so I think that, the fundamental propositions of Palestinian nationalism and the Palestinian project, it's very difficult to get them over that hump. And I think, as they're watching settlements go up and things change for the worse from their perspective over time, it's pretty difficult. But again, I mean, my own hope is, as you said, Mark, that sometimes when the whole paradigm shifts, other things will change. And obviously they could get worse. I mean, we know that that's true. But it's also possible that it could get better.
Although they do have a government that has said it's not interested in the aspirations of nationalism that you just referred to. So we're all going to have to wait for a change of leadership for those things to coalesce. But hopefully, as you're both saying, you can somehow build on this. There's a certain amount of cynicism amongst the Palestinian society that I think and a lack of leadership that is going to be an obstacle for a little while or a long while.
I think this is a natural segue into a topic that we had a lot of response on and a lot of curiosity about, and that was Ahmed Khalidi's presentation, introducing many to a well-informed, articulate, sophisticated representation of a Palestinian perspective. And Derek, you're going to make some comments on this, and I know Howard has some views afterwards, linking it with the refugees.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Ahmed, it was a very powerful talk that he gave, and I imagine that some of us found it jarring, but it was certainly valuable and necessary. To get back to something Dylan said, how this really goes back, the past isn't past, it's current events. And he expressed an ongoing feeling of disappointment and frustration and anger that goes back to 1967 and 1947. Disappointment, frustration against the Zionist movement, against Israel, against the international community, against the United States, and also self-criticism, that he expressed as well, and he's written about towards the Palestinians themselves. And I think that although we're thinking about the present, and I'll talk about the present in a couple of ways, the fact is that for Palestinians, it's not really the present that matters so much as the past. That is, the Palestinian political rhetoric is framed in something permanent and constant that really goes back to, if not 1947, 1917, perhaps, to the Balfour Declaration. The past really matters. History really, really matters. So, for example, Ahmed was with us just after Russia had invaded Ukraine and subjected it to levels of brutality not seen, in Europe since the Second World War. And Palestinians have responded with sympathy for the people of Ukraine, but they've said publicly and repeatedly, why has the Western world rushed to isolate Russia diplomatically and economically and to arm Ukraine when Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories, what has it done? What's the world done? Well, there's been a lot of rhetoric, a lot of anti-Israel rhetoric in the international community, but very little else. And clearly the scale of Russia's attacks against Ukraine, they far exceeded anything Israel has done in the occupied territories. And Israel, unlike Russia, has had to respond to a bona fide security threat, such as missile attacks from Gaza. But still, one can ask why decade after decade of Israeli, you just go through the list, colonization, land confiscation, physical abuse, incarceration, humiliation of Palestinians, denial of their freedom of movement to their jobs, to medical care, to education, even extrajudicial murder. All of this has gone on, for over half a century with the tacit support, certainly of the United States. And one does not have to even consider equivalency between Russia's assault against Ukraine and Israel's occupation of the Palestinians to decry the disparity between Western reactions to the two. So that Palestinian reaction that we're seeing in the Palestinian press, accusing the West of a double standard, we don't have to agree that the two are identical, because they're not, but we can still understand that this is reflecting a very deep-seated feeling of unfairness on the part of the Palestinians. Now, a lot of people listening today, or my friends on the panel, might say, well, the Palestinian cause is always being publicized and championed. The media is full of pro-Palestinian rhetoric. Our universities, can be seen, depending on who you read, to be hotbeds of pro-Palestinian activism. We saw what happened at McGill University recently. The student unions vote in favor of an economic boycott of Israel. There have been many such incidents at universities throughout North America and the United Kingdom. This is actually quite common. And on one level, if you mention all these things, I would agree with you, because the rhetoric is there. The rhetoric is certainly there, but governmental action regarding Israel has been very protective, as in the United States, where something like 28 American states have laws prohibiting government contracts with companies that openly boycott Israel. I guess you can boycott any other country and you can still get a government contract, but not Israel. And what have Palestinians been able to do in the international community concretely? I mean, aside from rhetoric, what luck have they had at the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court? In 2003, the International Court of Justice ruled that the rooting of the separation barrier was illegal. Well, that was, 19 years ago. By and large, the Palestinians have had very few champions in the realm of international jurisprudence. Yes, what was his name, Richard Falk, the UN rapporteur, issues statements that are highly critical of Israel. There was the Goldstone report. Again, it's rhetoric. It's rhetoric. It's not policy. And long gone are the days of, let's say, generous financial support for the Palestinians from the Soviet Union, or military support from the Soviet Union and communist China, more financial support from Saudi Arabia. A lot of this has dried up. Qatar keeps Gaza on life support. The European Union helps keep the Palestine Authority functioning economically. Iran sustains Hamas, but we cannot compare this level of material support with the just torrent of high technology weaponry that's coming into Ukraine. So what's happening is that in our own era, as in the past, Palestinians feel betrayed and they feel abandoned. And I understand why many supporters of Israel find it hard to accept that. If you go back all the way to the 1970s, when the international community was piling on the anti-Israel rhetoric at the United Nations, and the celebrity cult of Palestinian terrorism in the left throughout the world, in our own day, the dynamics of the BDS movement on North American campuses. But again, these are really small change. And I know the rhetoric is very small change compared with the enormous levels of military and diplomatic and economic support that Israel receives from its allies. And as we've just pointed out, these levels of support will be even more visible and augmented thanks to the Abraham Accords. So Palestinians continue to ask themselves, what did they do to deserve their dispossession? Why have they paid for Europe's crimes against the Jews? And the answer we just heard was, accept the two-state option, which is probably the only really viable option. And those Palestinians who have accepted the two-state option have reluctantly agreed that what they have no choice but to pay for something that was actually taken from them. So they lost something and they have to pay for it. And that's very hard to accept. Now, what about those who didn't accept a peaceful solution and who commit heinous, murderous acts? So this gets back to John's comments about the murders of Israeli citizens, the 11 who have been killed just in the last couple of weeks. It just shows us the legacy of 1948 and 1967 is still with us. And despite the optimistic rhetoric about the Abraham Accords, Israel remains a deeply insecure place. The separation barrier, Israel's network of informants, the Palestinian security services, they did not prevent these attacks. And it's especially worrisome that 2 of the attacks were perpetrated by Israeli citizens, and that radical Islamicism in the form of sympathy for ISIS or Islamic Jihad appears to have been a motivating force in most of the incidents. Now, these incidents, it's interesting, they're different from what Hamas has done or Islamic Jihad has done in the past. They don't have the meticulous organization of suicide bombings and the whole ritual cult of the construction of a suicide vest and all of that. But still, these are shooting attacks in the midst of Israeli urban centers. They're horrifically traumatizing and unsettling. And of course, the Israeli government will feel compelled to react with force. If they don't, then that leads to even further government instability, but no amount of force, no, to quote the IDF from the Gaza operations, no mowing the grass will actually assure that such attacks will end. As many Israeli officials, including former directors of the Shin Bet, have said, Israel's security problem is not a military problem. It is primarily a political one. And when Israel's political leaders acknowledge that reality and they begin to pursue creative solutions that can assure self-determination and dignity and security for Palestinians and for Israeli Jews alike, really Israel will have to accept that despite threats from Iran or from Hezbollah, the Palestinians remain at the heart of the conflict. I think only then can there really be opportunities for peace. So I'm really glad that Ahmed spoke with us, because we should never forget that despite Iran and despite the Emirates and despite Bahrain and Morocco, in the end, this is a conflict in which the Palestinians are at the very center. Okay, I'll stop there.
I come in. I watched the Khalidi interview. I wasn't participating because I wasn't in a position to participate at the time, as you all know. But I want to echo your sense, Derek, that it's really rooted in history. And they never escaped that history. And one of the things that I found when Khalidi gave his talk is the missing items in the history. And briefly, let me give them. And they were largely around refugees. There could be other things I could mention, but refugees. The first thing is about when he raised the question of how come the UN awarded Israel 55% when they only owned 77% of the land. It seemed to be them to be terrible. But if you go in the history of it, you understand that the motivation for the partition and the support for partition was not because of guilt over the Holocaust, but because they wanted to get rid of the 300,000 Jewish refugees in Europe that no one would take. And that was a big motivating factor. And it had to do with refugees. And leaving that out leaves out the whole sense of what was going on. It does at the same time reinforce his position that Europe was dumping its anti-Semitic problems onto the Palestinians in the Middle East. But there are other things left out. For example, when he talked about the refugees from the 48 war, when the Resolution 194 was passed, it was about Palestine refugees. Palestine refugees included 30,000 Jewish refugees who lost their homes, etc. And it wasn't until a year later that UNRWA renamed it as the Palestinian Arab refugees that they were concerned with, not for Jewish refugees, mainly because the Jewish refugees were all absorbed and resettled. But another part of that is that ethnic cleansing was total on the Arab side. It was not total, it was very extreme, I thought, but not total on the Jewish side. And I didn't think it was mainly about ethnic cleansing so much as security, but it was a mixture of both. Another point about this is Resolution 194. There's no debate among Palestinians, none that I can ever find. They always think it's about the right of return. But the resolution says nothing about the right of return. It's a hortatory resolution that says what Israel should do. Should repatriate them or compensate them or do something like that. But it doesn't grant a right of return. But over the years, particularly when they picked up the thing in the late 60s, they embraced the right, meaning the right of return. Before then, they didn't, because they expected to return behind an army and wipe out the Israelis. So they didn't argue about the right of return then. They didn't need a right of return. They were going to return. It's only when they began to recognize that return was problematic. And that's important because you get the refugees who are kept in refugee camps, unlike anywhere that we have, where the host society, which is the same ethnicity, keeps its own refugees in camps. And John talked about the source of Jenin is radical, radical terrorism and very much on the extreme end. And I spent time in Jenin camp, and we made a program on it. And he's right that that's there, but you can't ask, this is in Palestine. It's not anywhere else. There's another point about the refugees is he talked about there were 720,000 refugees, but that's wrong. When he said there were 200,000 refugees in Gaza, they're not refugees, they're internally displaced by international language. That's how he used it. They're within the Palestine, Israel and Palestine, they're there. And the same with the West Bank. And then if you take in the Jordanian refugees, they became citizens. So they're no longer refugees. So that part of the story is left out. That it's a difference, big difference between internally displaced, etc. We know in Ukraine, for example, you have 4.1 million refugees, but you got 7.1 million internally displaced in addition. And this distinction is always made because it's very important how you deal with the problem. One last point about it, because, and it goes back to the right of return, and it goes back to being rooted in history. If you read Shlomo Ben-Ami's book, which is just out on the negotiations and history from Camp David on, what becomes clear is that there were a lot of pragmatic discussions on arranging refugees. And when I was advising the Canadian government, we were involved in that. But they were really not the point. They never broke the issue. What always broke the issue was the right of return. This is Abbas held it, Arafat held it, unless every refugee has the right of return, which no Palestinian authority can take away because it's their right as individuals. Therefore, the right of return is sacred. Now, when you get a principle that's sacred instead of just a realistic problem, it's insoluble. Israel won't allow it. So when you go into why the peace accords didn't work, it was because that was the insoluble problem. And the second one was Sharm el-Sheikh, because as Arafat said, he would not grant any sharing of sovereignty over the site because he denied that Jews had a history. It was all phony. It was all made up. And granting that sovereignty or sharing that sovereignty was anathema. And so you have another religious principle that prevents any kind of realistic, pragmatic deal. And that's why the peace camp is shriveled, and that's why it's so difficult to figure a way out of this.
Go ahead, Dylan.
Thanks. Listening to Ahmed's talk, it was interesting to me because there were things that he said that I had a real issue with in terms of, the cherry picking of historical facts and things like that. Although I thought he was really respectful and a very articulate spokesperson for the Palestinian narrative. And when we left that conversation, I actually thought, well, the gap is so far between the two sides, actually. And for some of those who are on the panel, probably nobody in the audience knows this, but I mean, I'm not Jewish. And although I spend an inordinate amount of my time doing things in relation to the Jewish community, I'm on the board of CJPAC, and I still do things with CJA. But I guess what was also reinforced to me, because I know the Palestinian narrative pretty deeply from my own past as a critic of Israel when I was younger, that I mean, the founding myths and distortions of history and cherry picking are part of both narratives, and actually are part of pretty much every single national narrative. And, I mean, even in this country, looking at truth and reconciliation and facing down the history we have with our own indigenous peoples, which is so different than the history that most of us were taught in school. And my own background's Irish. And, you can look at the narratives in that conflict and the way they played out, as an example of the fact that I think the constant refrain that, you know, the Palestinians will never recognize Israel's legitimacy. I just don't know that many groups ever abandon their historical narratives entirely, you know, and I think the average person in Ireland now wouldn't say, hey, let's take up arms and liberate Belfast, but they certainly wouldn't say that they believe that it's part of the United Kingdom. So, you know, that was the big piece for me with the Palestinians. And I guess in my own mind, in terms of, you know, besides saying, boy, it's really awful and difficult, and there's a big gap to bridge. To me, I remember when Dennis Ross and David Makovsky, probably 10 years ago, were working out another attempt at an approach to solving the conflict called Borders First, which said, you know, if you can get a consensus on what should be an eventual Palestinian state and an Israeli state, then that is an approach that could lead to, you know, some pragmatism and progress moving forward. And a part of what they were talking about was a real Marshall Plan for the Palestinians in terms of economic growth, so that, you know, they see the fruits of peace paying off for them. And I think that has a lot of merit to it as an idea. And I think, you know, one of the challenges with the Israelis is, I remember being at the King Hussein border crossing once, crossing into Jordan with a group of business students. And the dean of the business school was a professor that worked on supply chains and logistics management. And he said, you know, it seems to me like a lot of problems would be solved if Israel just tried to facilitate the Palestinian goods getting out, rather than what seems like deliberately trying to obstruct it from getting out. And that was an interesting observation for a lot of things to me that go on there. And so, and I think it's really in Israel's national interest to see that happen. There's no world in which this group of people can remain impoverished and not, you know, not sovereign in perpetuity. And so I guess those were the things that occurred to me after the Khalidi talk. I found it really, really valuable, even though I felt quite uncomfortable and, you know, at a gut level, angry sometimes listening to it, but really valuable because it is the Palestinian perspective and it is the Palestinian narrative. And I think we need to know and understand it, whether we agree with it or not.
John.
Thanks. I'll just follow right up on that, Dylan. Steph Wertheimer, you know, who sold his company to Warren Buffett, had the exact same view as your professor from the business school, and you know, he tried to implement it but faced many obstacles. I would, in response, Howard, I would just say on the right of return, I'm not nearly as pessimistic as you. As we've discussed before, the Palestinians know that millions of Palestinians are not coming back. So there is going to be a number. That number was talked about in multiple negotiations. And yes, they want recognition of the right of return, but they're prepared, I think, ultimately will be prepared to accept compensation, which the international community will provide, not the Israelis, in lieu. So I don't really think the right of return has to be a definitive kind of obstacle. Also on Gaza, I mean, I think it's a bit odd to claim that the refugees in Gaza are internally displaced. You've got to be in your own country to be internally displaced, and the Palestinians don't have a country. Those refugees are in Israel. They were in Palestine, and then Israel took over. You know, I mean, Israel controls Gaza and controls the West Bank. So that is Israel. And those refugees are refugees. They're not internally displaced in their own lands. But, you know, that's, maybe we're just talking about semantics. Finally, again, I don't think that Al-Aqsa and the Temple Mount is an insurmountable obstacle to the conflict either. It's kind of shared now. Everybody other than Israel considers that that is, that's sort of Jerusalem is the land of three of the world's major religions. And I think we were talking the other day, many Israelis get it that East Jerusalem is going to be the capital if there ever is a Palestinian state. So I know those are always cited as major obstacles, and I think they are, and it's not going to be easy, but I don't think they're insurmountable going forward, in my view.
I have a comeback?
Of course.
Please.
And then to Derek.
Okay, let's take it in turn. There are three comments. There certainly were pragmatic arrangements and agreements on refugee return. And the Palestinians were often very forthcoming in some of the talks. And in fact, there were understood agreements on them. At the same time, they never gave up on the right of return. And there was a reason for them not giving up on the right of return, because they could make any arrangements that they want as long as the principle stood that Israel had to grant that every individual had the right to claim that right of return. And they weren't, by their arrangements, they weren't taking anything away from that. And it was any reading, I think, of the negotiations at Taba back to Camp David show that that was a breaking point, a key breaking point. It wasn't the only one, but it was a major one. Secondly, your discussion that, there wasn't internally displaced because it wasn't part of their land. But remember, they went to Gaza when Israel wasn't there. Israel wasn't there between 48 and 67. So they went to their own land. And it doesn't have to be a state or a country. If you go to your own national land, you're internally displaced. And I think it is semantics, but the semantics are clear. And the history of that language about refugees is clear about the difference between internally displaced and not. As for the Al-Aqsa issue, again, there were lots of arrangements and discussions with the pragmatic side of the negotiators, of which there were many, and they were very forthcoming, and there were all kinds of deals made that could have been part of a peace agreement. But every time, first Arafat and then Assad, but anyway, said no. And they said no for this reason that Derek started with, is it goes back into history. Who does the land really belong to? And they want to deny that Israel had ever any right to the land. And that kind of thing would be to them acknowledging such a right.
I'll just say one thing. One of the final status issues is end of the conflict and all disputes. So right of return, if the Israelis are ever going to agree on anything, you can't come back on it and say, oh, by the way, we've got another issue to bring up. The deal has got to be over. So, but anyways, I take what you say. And
Derek and Mark.
I think what Howard's pointed out just how, devilishly complicated this situation is. And one way to deal with it is to sort of just go through empirical reality and try to frame it in different ways. So, was Gaza part of Palestine or not? Egypt took it in the 1948 war. Egypt created a puppet all-Palestine government under Amin al-Husseini, but come on, this wasn't real. It was not Palestine. And the same thing is true what happens with the West Bank. The territory is taken by Jordan, which technically annexes it. I think the annexation is recognized by Pakistan, one other country in the world. So we have an anomalous situation. And that's why comparative historians and international relations scholars and the like throw their hands up when it comes to Israel-Palestine, because the models that we develop for so much of the rest of the world just don't work. And the same thing is true just in general, if we're going to talk about refugee issues, to compare it with refugee issues elsewhere. For example, the right of return. I mean, Howard's totally right about UNGA 194. It says nothing about a right of return. And as Howard himself has written, the idea of right of return develops in the 60s, 70s primarily, but it's been half a century, and Palestinians claim that right. And that concept has a great deal of support in the international community. So the notion that a right was not proclaimed in 1948 doesn't mean that it can't develop or can't exist. So we have to deal with this situation now where Palestinians do claim this right. And I wish I could believe, although I want to believe, John, that this can be negotiated through recognition, that what these people want is recognition, and that the actual return of Palestinians will be very limited, and there'll be other forms of repatriation, compensation, and so on. The fact is, there's a new book that just came out on Palestinian Israeli voices about the conflict, in which one Palestinian author quite seriously is planning for the return of millions of Palestinians to empty space in the state of Israel. I know that all of us think of Israel as a pretty crowded country, but he thinks it's pretty empty. He doesn't really acknowledge that the Negev is not the easiest place to build big cities. And reading it, I felt a little bit like, it was like listening to Jews at Ateret Kohanim talk about the restoration of the Third Temple. It's just this messianic language that some people take seriously. So I am concerned about that. But I do think that decisions come from the top, and that it is ultimately the Israeli leadership which holds the cards and is the more powerful force. If it takes steps forward, and I hope we'll have time to talk about some of these most recent proposals on the table to move things forward, that Palestinians can and will respond. Palestinian support for two-state options has risen and fallen over the years. We're at a nadir now. And I think the nadir reflects the political situation of the Palestinians and the Israelis right now. So, bold leadership on the Israelis' part, I think, could make a huge difference.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify a couple of points. John, I think you said that Israel doesn't recognize that Jerusalem is the city of the three major religions. I'm not.
Oh, no, I just said the world kind of recognizes that, and therefore I would think that it will have to be solved. I didn't suggest that Israel doesn't recognize it.
Okay, I thought I heard you say that, so I just wanted to clarify that, because we know that Jordan since '67 has been given, even before that, the control of the Temple Mount. So that's an important point. It's not clear to me what was meant by Israel controlling the Gaza right now, which is post the evacuation of Gaza. The final thing I wanted to say is that what I find interesting about one thing that I find interesting about the refugee issue and the discussion of reparations to Palestinian refugees is that there's never been any really frontal discussion about reparations for Jewish refugees out of the Arab lands following the '48 war, and it's never going to happen, of course. But it's something that people don't seem to really discuss. Martin Gilbert wrote a whole book about it, about the Jews out of the Arab lands, and it's not something that's really getting ever received a lot of attention. And it's not. I'm not suggesting it should be thrown into the mix, but I just think it's an interesting historical perspective that's not really talked about very much.
Howard, very briefly.
Very briefly, come back to Derek's point that it really depends on the stronger power and the guys at the top making decisions. But we know, and I don't understand you holding that position, Derek. Perhaps you could explain it, because if you look at the peace talks, Barak was very suspicious of peace talks. He wasn't but he put a Dove committee together that negotiated, and he ended up backing them, just as other people have backed into, as Rabin did. And it didn't make a difference in the end. And Khalidi, who I was very impressed by, I like him a lot and read him, but he said that, and he believed that the territorial divisions was the key issue. And I think any reading of the negotiations said, no, the territorial issue was solvable. There was the 20% of the settlers, it was a big problem, but there were solutions provided by both sides on that. So that I don't see right now that it's Israeli being primarily responsible. I don't care what leader we get, whether it's a bad one like Netanyahu or a very a good one who's got a vision of a human rights world, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think there'll be a deal until things change in the Palestinian community.
I guess we won't know until we have, I would like to have the opportunity to test that hypothesis. Let's put it that way. I would love Israel to get better leadership and see what would happen. And as far as, again, historical debates, there's a lot of different ways of looking at what happened at the second Camp David, at the failed Camp David summit, some of which, again, places the blame on the Palestinians, but Hussein Agha, and I think Ahmed, I forget if he was writing this piece with, maybe it was Malley and Khalidi, Robert Malley, or maybe it was Hussein Agha, because they all co-write articles together. I mean, their view of Camp David is very different from what you just said about who was responsible for the failure. They say it was largely the Israelis, bullying tactics, and of course the demand for a promise of a total end of conflict, when offering something rather vague, that the Palestinians felt forced to accede to. The fact that the sides distrusted each other so much that they weren't talking directly with each other, and so on. I mean, there's lots of literature on this that shows the Israeli position as having been quite, really quite confrontational. And there's a book that tries really hard to reconcile these different approaches that the diplomats in the virtual room would like. It was co-written by Khalil Shikaki and what's his name? The guy, Feldman, the guy at Brandeis. He's formerly from the security services, and now he's a professor of Middle Eastern studies at Brandeis.
Noah Feldman?
Sorry?
Noah Feldman?
It's not Noah Feldman, it's another Feldman. It's an Israeli Feldman as opposed to the American Noah Feldman. Anyway, and an Egyptian scholar. And it's a book that presents, every major event in the history of the conflict. There's like an Israeli perspective, a Palestinian perspective, an Arab perspective, and they try to knit it all together. And frankly, it's a very boring book because they're trying so hard. But for those people who really want to get to the, like, oh my God, there's so many different ways of thinking about the right of return. There's so many different ways of thinking about what happened at Camp David, Camp David 2. This book is really good. And I can send it around to all of you, send the reference to it.
That'd be great.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left, and there are so many other topics we haven't even touched upon. The one that we had agreed amongst ourselves that we should at least frame a little bit, and it will only be a brief conversation, is about what is occurring right now in Ukraine. And actually, when I said the Ukraine, you can tell that I was raised during the Soviet era, and it's now Ukraine, and perhaps that's at the root of the problem.
How do you pronounce Kiev?
Yeah, exactly, that too. Spell it. So, one question, of course, is where does Israel fit in all of this? And in terms of the larger scheme of the Russian-Ukraine conflict, it doesn't. It's not a major actor. The fact that Bennett has tried to insert himself or make himself available as a mediator is reflective, I think, very much of a particular part of Israeli domestic social interests and political interests, and a recognition that there's a very significant part of Israeli society that have roots, and not necessarily very distant roots, in Russia and Ukraine. The commentary that I have picked up on, and we don't have to go through all the details, which almost everyone will be aware of. First of all, is the acknowledgement of the perceived indecisiveness of Israeli leadership and the division among Israeli leaders. That you have the prime minister who says little and who vacillates and doesn't come down condemning Russia or offering immediate support to Ukraine. who instructs his government not to initially support UN resolutions. A foreign minister who takes a very different position, is more outspoken in terms of support for Ukraine. Finance minister who says some outrageous things in support of Russia. A defense minister who is looking through the lens of both his previous experience and is concerned about the strategic corridor between Israel and Syria and Russia's role. And on the other hand, is also playing domestic politics. So you have a sense within Israel that, as one distinguished journalist said, and then I've heard a number of academics use the same phrasing, is that Israel is increasingly not on the right side of history, and that this has to change. And it has to change for a number of reasons. Perhaps the most important in the long term is that wars must eventually come to an end, even though perhaps the Israeli-Palestinian one suggests that conflicts don't necessarily come to an end. And if there is, or when there is an ending to this particular war, there will be a regrouping in Europe, with the United States, with other Western powers. And where is Israel going to fit into this? That if Israel's future is tied increasingly, as one hand, a respected and increasingly accepted member within at least the Abraham Accords network of the Middle East, but on the other hand, a member of the OECD, of the Western Coalition, and which its relationship now with the United States is with, on the military side, is through CENTCOM. It has to eventually, sooner rather than later, take a stand. And there is a concern among many Israeli commentators that I've engaged or that I've observed, that Israel is running out of time, and that it has hurt itself in a significant way by not being on what this phrase, the right side of history. Moreover, that Bennett is not being shown, at least not yet, as having been an effective mediator. And the extent to which that is the perception, he's going to face pressure to take this a much more well-defined stand, I think. It may create an opportunity for him to try and recover. I'd argue that the quicker Israel accepts what some are arguing is an emerging paradigm shift, or a shift in how we understand the international order and the issue of the intersection of morality and values and principles and norms in international politics, the longer Israel waits, the more damaging it is to Israeli interests.
Can I comment on your
just a couple more points. I think a cooperative security network is going to emerge much more pragmatically, but also underpinned by a combination of realpolitik and values and norms and self-preservation. And that cooperative security network is going to be primarily the old transatlantic, but with the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians, American leadership. And this is an opportunity to facilitate the connection with those who connected through the Abraham Accords. One can imagine an emerging new Middle East order in which there is an ability for Israel to facilitate actions within and amongst this new structure within the Middle East of cooperative relations, and being a bridge to Europe and the United States. In a way, Middle East Arab states and no longer automatically fear the intervention of the Americans, that it becomes a different kind of a relationship. This could be transformative, if Israel takes advantage of the opportunity. The final point is where Turkey fits. If, in fact, Erdogan sees that his own future is on the precipice, he's going to move increasingly back into the fold of being an associate member of the EU, being a productive member of NATO, trying to re-engage the Americans in a more positive way, reduce his connection with Russia in terms of military hardware, because he also has an interest in keeping the Black Sea open and having an influence in the Balkans. This is an opportunity for a reemergence of an Israeli-Turkish understanding of the emergence of the Mediterranean. What I'm trying to suggest in a very brief statement is that this is more than just Israeli domestic politics. The potential here is for Israel to be a partner in the reorganization of networks of interstate relations that affect the Middle East and that affect the larger international community in some interesting ways. And for Israel not to be more aggressive in a proactive leadership role, and to be indecisive, and to allow the internal domestic sensitivities of party politics to get in the way, is, I think, in the long run, potentially very harmful to Israel.
My comment is simple. You've given a pitch why we have to continue the conversation.
Anyone want to jump in, or that's just a way to wrap things up and turn it back to Zachary? Rabbi Goodman, sir.
It's Zachary to each of you, to anyone, it's fine. Thank you all so much for this session, for all of the sessions. I think it's worth noting for our viewers that this doesn't come together as just an hour sitting together, that so much time and energy and intention has gone into what the conversations are going to be about, how each conversation was going to run. It's not just something that, we snap our fingers and pulls together. But so I really want to thank you all for your thoughtfulness, for your expertise, for your time. It's been a real gift to our community and to the larger world. We've had folks joining us from many different countries and from different religious backgrounds and different community structures. So really, thank you for this gift that you've given us. I'm going to stop short of saying what the game plan and plans are for the Israel dialogues moving forward. I know this circle needs to reconvene and do some planning. So we'll just end with a word of gratitude to each of you, to everyone who has spent time with us each week, as well as to all of the sponsors, Helena and David Fine, as well as all of our communal partners who have been instrumental in pulling this together. So we'll end with gratitude. I know we began with gratitude. We'll end with gratitude, and truly thank you. Shabbat Shalom to all who celebrate. And I think for now we'll sign off for the Israel Dialogues.
Shabbat Shalom.
Take care. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Shabbat Shalom.
Thanks. Thanks, David.
Pleasure.